Hello, and welcome to mentorDINO. I'm your host, Caitlin Rossier. I am an architect and founder of mentorDINO. I firmly believe that architecture, engineering, and construction professionals can achieve true success by embracing human skills as their guiding principle. So each week, I interview amazing professionals in and around the AEC industry as a way to share stories, inspiration, and advice for others finding their own unique career path. Thank you to all of our current subscribers, and if you're new, we'd love to have you join our community. So if you like this episode, please do me a favor and hit subscribe, like, or leave a comment below. It really helps others be able to discover this resource and support them on their own career journey. So let's dive in. I really hope you enjoy this conversation. Welcome to the mentorDINO podcast. I would like to welcome Angela Mazzi, Principal and Senior Medical Planner of GBBN Architects out in Cincinnati, Ohio. Thank you, Angela, for taking the time to speak with me today.
Caitlin, thank you for having me. I'm really excited to have this chance to chat about career paths and how to make your own way as an architect.
Yeah, so let's dive in. I always start out with my loaded question. If you don't mind introducing yourself to my listeners to let them know a little bit more about your experience and journey so far in education and career.
Sure. This is my origin story, so I feel like a superhero. I kind of oddly had connections when I look back from even very young. So I always thought that space felt like something, and I would do weird things like climb on top of the refrigerator or behind the couch. And I noticed that a room felt like a totally different place from a different vantage point. So I think I was always sensitive to space, and I loved anything I could build with, whether it was cardboard boxes or Legos. I would draw apartment section elevations in my lined notebook paper during class. So I think I always had an affinity to this. But what's interesting is it's that whole, if you see it, you can be it thing. Nobody in my family was in architecture or any other adjacent profession. So it never occurred to me to be an architect. I wanted to be an art major and paint. And that terrified my mother. So she's the one that connected the dots, had me tour some local architecture firms. And I thought, okay, yeah, that makes sense. But I have to say, going in cold to college at Carnegie Mellon was a little bit of a rude awakening because some people had a lot of architecture background. And I sort of knew who Frank Lloyd Wright was, right? So I was really faced with a steep learning curve. But I thought that the opportunities I had there and some of the really amazing classes I took really lined up with that sensitivity I had to space. So I took a course that I called Life Changing, that was the psychology of habitation. And I was like, wow, there's actually science behind the impact that space has on us that can influence how we behave or how we feel or what activities we do. That's amazing. And I also loved my architecture history classes. So I minored in that and organizational behavior, which also kind of pulled in social and cultural influences. And I like to think that that kind of followed me through my career, that I've always investigated that and been kind of the bone collector for any information or research I can find about that. So fast forward to today, research is a big part of my work as an architect, and I specialize in something called salutogenesis, or design for well-being. So I get to really do deep dives in how space can impact how we feel and help us be our best selves and be our most productive and get the most out of our experience in a space.
Yeah, and really kind of tying it all together for when you kind of stumbled upon that class really highlights that you don't know what you're getting into till you start trying to figure it out and carve away and have that light bulb moment?
Yeah, and sometimes you just have to kind of try different things, or if something interests you, don't be afraid to pursue it, because you don't know what doors it can open for you that then are going to lead you in a different direction. Because it's interesting, at this point in my career, I pursued AIA fellowship and fellowship in a specialty certification, the American College of Healthcare Architects, and other kinds of awards. And it always requires that retrospective view of your profession and your whole career. And looking back, it's like, oh, this has always been here. It doesn't look like now what I thought it would have looked like when I was 18 or even 30, but the through line is still there. So that's kind of cool to see.
Yeah. And when you go for fellow, it really makes you step back. And I think a lot of people don't take that time to figure out where that common thread was in their career, how they got somewhere. They just keep rolling with it. I hate to say like rolling with the punches, but very much just staying in the present. And we forget to go back and see how we got there. Because sometimes it's those magical moments. You're like, oh, that person really made that connection, or attending that conference, that course, that professor really pivoted something for you that you may have forgotten about.
Yeah. And then it all kind of comes together. I think you and I were talking when we met at the Women's Leadership Summit a few weeks ago, this idea that you start to connect the dots. So what feels like, oh my gosh, I've done all this different stuff, I can't make sense of it. When you do that retrospective look, you actually see a constellation show up out of that sky full of stars.
Yeah. And even before we started recording today, I know you talked a little bit about going for your master's degree to start off your career. So I definitely wanted to dive into that too, after, your CMU education and coming out in not the best economic times, and how you picked a different school for your master's.
Sure. So I hated school. I almost didn't want to major in architecture because it was a 5-year Bachelor of Architecture degree, but I did it anyway and gloriously graduated to no job offers and had to move back home with my parents and do other kinds of jobs that had really nothing to do with being an architect. Now, in my grand master plan for my career back then, I had thought I would work, get my license, then go back and get a master's degree so I could teach. Well, in the predicament I was at that time, I decided, well, let's just rearrange and put graduate school ASAP. That way I can go to graduate school in a part of the country that's doing better economically than Northeast Ohio. And I can get that master's degree and then work and get my license and so on and so forth. So I looked at schools in different parts of the Western United States and ended up going to the University of Arizona, mostly because since I had a professional degree, it was only a 1-year program. And they had this great policy that in the master's programs at their university, you could take classes at the master's level anywhere in the university. So I didn't take any studio classes. I took psychology classes and anthropology classes and more history and theory classes and other really great social and cultural exploration classes that the architecture department offered, which was actually a great experience because I got so much more clarity. Something that had been a sparked interest for me back in undergrad was suddenly like, now I know what I really want to focus on. And I did my thesis on how telecommuting has impacted our understanding of the home. So that kind of, tied it all together. And it was a lot of fun. It was very clarifying, and I think it positioned me well. And it also left me in the southwestern United States where the economy was a little bit better. So it was easier to get a job when I graduated.
Yeah. And how did you decide to stick then with architecture and not go down like a psychologist researcher route?
That's a good question.
I don't know. Because you talk
did.
about all the little things, and it's
Yeah.
a lot of people, when you graduate during a recession, so many people leave and pivot and find another path. And even with your master's being so different than many other masters, very different than my master's degree in architecture, and you still ended up back in the architecture path.
Yeah, so I didn't ever really think about that till right now, but what I think was part of it is a little bit of defiance. So we've all had that experience of you get into the architecture program, it's very competitive. Most people drop out. In fact, our first day, they're like, take a look around you, 2/3 of you won't graduate. So there was this defiance that kind of sprouted when I was struggling to deal with my learning curve, that I will not leave this program. I will not be forced out. And maybe that's a little bit of what stuck with me, that I was going to find a way to make it work. But also, I think by then I'd had enough of an immersion into the idea that design makes a difference, that I felt called to be one of those people who was going to make a difference through the work I was doing. Though I did toy with getting a doctorate and whether or not that was worth pursuing, but I ended up getting a good job offer and kind of derailing that.
Yeah, and get out of the education line.
And I have never taught. I've been a guest lecturer, but I never did end up being a professor in any capacity.
Yeah, you never know. We'll get to it later because I find you already teach. You just do it in a different way. So
true.
But I wanted to stick on the architecture theme before we jump into everything else you're doing. And so how did the other specialty you have is specializing in healthcare design and medical planning. So how did you start to figure out that specialty as you start your career? Because we haven't really brought up the healthcare side yet within education.
Well, I didn't. In fact, it's a little bit ironic because my father was a doctor and his fondest hope was that my sister or myself or both of us would follow in his footsteps and take over his practice. And both of us were like, no way. And I did not start out thinking I was going to do healthcare at all. In fact, I was much more interested in design for, special needs kinds of environments, housing, urban design connected things. But the firm I was working for in Arizona was doing some healthcare work, and they put me on a project when another one I was working on had gone on hold. So it was a very minor role that I played. A few years later, needed to relocate back to Northeast Ohio, where I'm from, because my parents' health had really gone into decline. By then, I'd had my first baby. I was on maternity leave, and it just felt like the right thing to do. So I reached out to a colleague of mine who worked at a different firm that I knew had a Cleveland, Ohio office. And he put my resume in, and I ended up getting the job at this firm in Cleveland. And during my interview, they looked at my portfolio. They saw this one project, and they said, "Oh, you do healthcare." And I said, "I do," because I would never have presented myself that way. But what I noticed as I worked on these projects was something just kind of clicked for me. I seemed to be able to understand the flows and the needs of the people in the space almost intuitively, and all the things that I cared about mattered that much more in healthcare, because it isn't just the patient. The patient is there for a very small amount of time. The staff, though, this is where they work, and they have very little control over their environment. So if you don't design it the right way, you make everything they do more difficult. So I realized that I could have a even bigger impact on people's well-being and see a much more immediate kind of cause and effect of the work I was doing in healthcare. So it felt aligned with where I was already interested. So it wasn't that hard of a jump to say, okay, I could specialize in that.
Yeah. And I know when a lot of students come out of school, they struggle with, what do they want to do? What types of projects they want to work on? And then they get worried that they don't know what they want to work on yet. And I'm like, you don't have to know that yet. Just try out different things. And you never know, once you experience something, how then that's more dots you find to figure out how that connects back. Because when you said like the social science, psychology, I've done a number of healthcare projects and I see exactly how that connects. But a lot of people look at healthcare design and think it's just sterile or no design opportunities, and it's a different type of design. So,
yeah, absolutely. It is, in some ways, there's a lot of restrictions and codes, but there's also a lot of opportunities. And there is a big difference between what a code says, which is a minimum requirement, and best practice. And that's really the world I like to play in, is where is that best practice and how do we help our clients get there to really get the results they want to get out of a space?
yeah, because I always like the quote, the worst building you can build is to code minimum. And it's not always the best way to go about it. So even though there's a lot of rules, if you're not restricting yourself to just meeting minimums, there's opportunities to work better, have the staff have better options, have growth opportunities for a hospital because technology changes so quickly.
Yeah, definitely. There's opportunities, but where research comes in, and a lot of people don't realize it, is you can start to show the ROI of design. I go to a lot of conferences that have healthcare executives or healthcare engineers or, the staff people. And the issues that they talk about are not that different than the issues that we care about as architects. They definitely want user experience. They have all these other things on their balance sheet that matter based on user experience. Things like recruitment and retention, things like lawsuits, things like education and training. There's things like test scores that could affect school funding, absenteeism or presenteeism, which can be more detrimental if you don't have staff engagement. So they get it. They just have no idea that their space could contribute to any of this stuff. And when we can use research in our design, we can start to show that this is an investment and it isn't just about meeting functional needs, that code minimum stuff, or about looking nice, the aesthetics, but it actually can make a difference in the way the organization works and the costs for them to operate every single year.
Yeah. And just seeing how much they can improve as a business. So there's so much that we can do to help. And for those interested in healthcare design and are looking for different ways to get involved and other things to kind of strengthen their knowledge, I know you mentioned the American College of Healthcare Architects. Can you speak a little bit about that organization or other ones you've been a part of to help build your network on the healthcare side?
Sure. So that was abbreviated as ACHA. And when I was working at this firm in Cleveland, I was getting ready for my annual review. And I had noticed that my boss had those letters after his name, and so did our managing principal. And I'm like, I don't know what that is. So I looked it up. I'm like, oh, it's a specialty certification for people that do healthcare. And it basically is a testimonial to your true expertise in the field that you then have to maintain year after year through continuing education. So you have to submit a portfolio, pass an exam, have colleagues as well as clients and others in the industry write letters of support that shows an independent third party that you are truly an expert in this field. I'm like, well, if I'm going to do this, I should pursue this. And so I worked toward that. And the very first thing I did when I got certified, I was at a healthcare conference where they have their annual luncheon. And so I was invited as a new certificant. And afterwards, I went up to the current president and I said to him, how can I get involved? And he said, see that guy over there? He is chairing our education committee and he needs people. Go talk to Mark. So I did and really enjoyed working with Mark. He became a good friend. And over the time I spent on the education committee, I was eventually asked to be the co-chair and then the chair. And I loved working at a committee level. Highly recommend, no matter what you do, get involved with professional organizations and be active on committees, because that's where you really build your network, because you're working on event planning or initiatives or projects with your colleagues. So you get to know these people really well. And eventually that led to an invitation to join the board and ultimately be the president of the organization in 2021. So it was a really great run that has resulted in me having colleagues all over the country that do healthcare design, many of whom I keep in touch with. I really enjoy seeing them at different events related to the healthcare industry throughout the year. And we've collaborated on projects. We've also, it's interesting what a small world it is, because you start to go to other things that you don't think are in your industry, and yet you see the same people. So it's just really interesting that people who are leaders and they show up everywhere. And so the fact that because through one organization, I got to know them really well. Now, when I see them somewhere else, or there's an opportunity, or somebody needs a referral for something, I'm a name on their list and they're a name on my list.
Yeah. And you never know when you're going to work on a project with them, or they're going to shift to the owner's side. Exactly. Or you shift or something. So I always get thrown off when you are used to seeing the same people in a certain context. Then you see them outside that context. It always takes me a second. I'm like, I can't place you where, and I always feel bad if I can't place them right away. But it's always when you see them other places, you're not expecting it, or they don't have their hard hat on if you're used to them on a job site. So.
Yeah, it cracks me up. Once in a while, we'll go to the big AIA national conference, and I don't think I'm going to see people I know. And there's so many people that go to this. It's like, 9 or 10,000 people every year. And yet I see all kinds of people that I know, whether they are from the healthcare industry or old colleagues from other firms I've worked in around the country, or people I went to school with, or somebody who I know from the news, or who knows me from my work who I haven't met yet. And it's crazy. I was like, this shouldn't be happening. There's so many people here. What are the odds?
Yeah. But then trying to find time to schedule to actually meet up is always harder than just stumbling upon somebody. So you never know. But I wanted to pivot on to more what you're doing on the side beyond architecture, because you have How We Met is through your architecting podcast. So beyond specializing as a healthcare architect, how did you decide to expand into your own business, and what are you doing over there, to give my listeners kind of a heads up on what we're diving into?
Sure. So, as you might have picked up on by this point, I'm really passionate and convicted in the things I do. And I feel that having that why and having that clarity is what helps us have an impact. And I am here for world changing. I do not think it's crazy to say that. I really do believe that as architects, we can make such a powerful difference in the world. However, it is very, very technically difficult to do our job and to be competent as an architect. We all know this. We've all had that experience. So it's, as a result, very, very easy to get stuck there. Just doing everything it takes to put together a good set of drawings, to listen to your client, to follow the codes. And a lot of people that I would encounter had really become disillusioned with the profession. I'd had my own experiences with that. And I started to see that, when people were unhappy, they would change jobs, but wherever you go, there you are. And because they didn't have that clarity, they didn't know what to ask for. So after the shiny penny of the new job had worn off, that halo effect, about a year in, they were equally as unhappy as they'd been at the other job. And it just sort of became a mission that I had starting in like 2010, so that long back, that we need to think differently about what we're doing. We need to reclaim that spark. We need to start really putting ourselves out there. And it started with a blog called The Patron Saint of Architecture that I did from 2010 to 2016. But then I went on a little break and somebody said to me, you should start a podcast. And I went to podcast school, took the course to learn how to do it. And architecting started in January of 2021. But I wanted to keep that same mission that we need to find our way. We need to be unflinching advocates for quality design. We need to know what we love, and we need to use that, because my career may not look like your career, but it doesn't mean we're not both making a big difference through the things that we're each passionate about. So that's what I try to do. I call it the inside job, because most people, when you talk to them, are afflicted with overwhelm, stress, and burnout. And when you try to talk about things like, oh, you should be active in a professional organization, or, oh, you should do research, what's the answer you get? I'd love to, but, or I'm too busy. And so I really wanted to have support there for people to see that you can do these things and you can have what I call success on your terms.
Yeah. And you don't have to be super involved in every organization. I think that's where people start to get that overwhelm of they need to get involved in 10 organizations or be on 12 boards and then have a life and be a good architect. And it's, no, you just got to find what works for you and what that balance is. If somebody is not a parent, they're going to have more time available than somebody that is a parent. And that's just natural on what time commitments you have. But sometimes those organizations have nothing to do with architecture at all. And you can be very involved in something else.
And it's actually important that you do that. So I'm glad you brought that up. It's something called the adjacent possible. So if all you do is the same thing, you start to do what you know works. It's something called the liability of expertise, right? So then you're actually less creative and you rule out possibilities because you already know it won't work. But when you feel stuck, or you want to be more well-rounded, the best thing you could do is go to the movies or go to a museum, because all of a sudden you'll be exposed to something that will inspire you, even though looking at sculpture, you might say, has nothing to do with this school I'm designing. But something you see you will be inspired then as to a way to solve the problem that you're working on. So it's actually really important that you be a well-rounded person.
Yeah. And I know you also mentioned the stress, overwhelm, and burnout. Have you had those particular experiences in your career, and how did you pull yourself through those challenges?
So my first experience was my sophomore year in architecture school. I had this very toxic professor who pushed the idea of the all-nighter, which we already kind of get a little too much glamorization of. But this crazy lady would come in at 2 a.m. So it was really encouraged. And I got very sick. So sick, in fact, that my parents wanted me to take the next year off. I was diagnosed with chronic fatigue syndrome. Remember, I didn't want to be in school any longer than I had to. So I refused to take any time off because I wanted to graduate on time. But I had experiences of having my alarm go off at 6 a.m. and not having any conscious memory until it was dark outside because I had just passed out, or waking up on the floor of the shower and not knowing how long I had been there. And it was just because I was pushing my body when I was exhausted. And I had to learn that third year of school how to work smart versus working hard. So that was what started it, this realization that when you are well rested, when you take care of yourself, you can do more better in less time. And I tried to carry it through my career, but of course there were always times that could be difficult. And one of those was right after moving to Cleveland. As I said, we relocated because of my parents' health. So I have a baby that's under a year old. I have sick parents who are in Youngstown, not Cleveland. So it's an hour and a half away, and I can only get to them on the weekends, but it means I have to then drive on the weekends. And I have a husband who's now my ex-husband who didn't really want to move, who's not being very supportive. And this firm that seemed like a good fit was actually a very toxic work environment. There was a lot of gaslighting going on for everybody, not just me, and a lot of what I call the blood from a stone mentality. And in fact, the managing principal would say things like, there are 3 8-hour periods in a day. That's just not how anybody should think about working. So with all of this, I can remember times walking from my desk to the printer. I had to walk down this long hallway and feeling like a robot that was short circuiting, like sparks were flying off of me, or like my arm might fall off at any moment, or screws were flying off. And it was a really tough time. And it was during the time at that firm that I also made the decision to start the blog and really look at that toxic culture that can happen in many firms. And we normalize it, and we think that we're lucky to have a job, or that this is just the way it is. And so it gets perpetuated, and it's not helping anybody. And that was when I really started to be an advocate through the blog, but also through when I looked for other jobs, being very clear about my boundaries so that I didn't end up in a situation like that again.
Yeah. And I know we smirk and laugh about those feelings, but when you go through that, because I've gone through my series of burnouts in my career, and it can be debilitating and affect who you are as an architect, and then feel like you're not cut out for it. A lot like in college where they said 2/3 of you aren't going to graduate. It's like, that starts to come back again. Or am I not going to get licensed if you're trying to get through the licensure process and you're burned out? And so it doesn't have to be that way. And I think that's important to why you started blogging and everything you speak towards, because it doesn't have to be that way. And if somebody is dealing with it, because it still happens, a lot in firms, and we haven't had a big pivot. We're getting there, but
yeah, slowly. But I think that every time there's a shift, even if it's not as big of a shift as we would hope for, there's always the naysayers, but they're proven wrong. It works. Like the pandemic forced everyone to experiment with something that most businesses thought was too risky, which is allowing everybody to work from home. You didn't have a choice, right?
Yeah.
And we found out, oh, hey, this can work. So I think every time we're forced to make a shift, but we see that it can work, it helps to move the needle a little bit more. But I also am a big advocate for raising awareness about what I call the systemic codependency in the whole AEC industry. And it starts with our education. I told you the story of the crazy professor who would come in at 2 a.m. There is this myth that you must overperform in order to be any good. If you have a good idea right away, well, too bad. You need to redo it 10 more times because it doesn't count if it was too easy. Yeah. And of course, we're taught how to design. We're not taught how to run a business. We're not taught human relations or things like that. So a lot of firms don't hire that expertise, especially smaller firms. And so people are unqualified as leaders for dealing with a lot of the issues, and they're only perpetuating what they already knew. So if they came of age in their career in a toxic work environment, they perpetuate that. And the thing with codependency is it's about proving your worth all of the time. And think about where our industry would be if we believed in our worth more. We don't. We're always undercutting one another on fee. We're competing because we don't really believe that we're worth anything. And, it's not about, I'm not codependent because I'm a strong character or I'm resilient. It's really about making other people happy at the expense of your own well-being. And is that not what so many of us, if not all of us, are doing all day long? And, signs of this are need for control, perfectionism, suppressing your emotions, losing your identity and a sense of what you actually want or need. Like, right? When you talk to people who are stressed out, they don't even know what they want. They just know they're miserable.
Yeah, and they don't know where to start. Or if somebody does ask them for help, they don't know what help they need because they're just drowning at that moment. And they're trying to look for a life preserver, but they forget what they could use to help them float because they're too worried trying to figure out where the surface is.
And it's structured into our profession, which is why we need to be outspoken about it and really stop overlooking or taking for granted institutionalized ways of work, because how this gets structured is overperforming, right? We can't come to a meeting with 1 or 2 options. We have to have 10. Or lack of respect for schedules. I don't care if you have this meeting. I want you to drop everything for that. Sacrificing fees or staff well-being to please a client. So they change something and you don't say, great, we will work on that and get back to you in a week. They want it the next day and your boss says yes. Well, what does that do to everybody, right? Mm-hmm. And as long as that happens and keeps happening and we have these structures where that's okay, we're going to keep perpetuating this.
Yeah. And I've even seen where it's the architect saying, I'll give it to you the next day. And it's the client's like, okay, could have had it next week. Like, why not start out with the longer range? And if you can get it to them in a couple days, then you're only impressing the client more rather than putting a harder deadline on yourself that didn't need to be there. So, or if you do need to push it through in a day because you have another deadline, then fine. But tell them, hey, you've got a week so you could sleep and make sure you got rid of typos and grammar mistakes, or bring on somebody else to help.
Exactly. When I was working in Phoenix, we had a consultant who was a traffic engineer. And, he was a consultant, so things were a little bit different. But he would go back to Nigeria for a couple months in the summer, and he would just close his office. And that was what he did every year. And he gave everyone advance notice, but you weren't going to get work out of him in that period of time. And it seems so crazy. And I don't think most architecture firms could do something quite to that level. But it really made me look and go, the client is okay with this. They said okay. They didn't go rush off and find another traffic engineer. In fact, they respect this man's time more because he set boundaries.
Yeah. I always look back at how work used to be done. Like when my grandfather went to work, he had to drive in. He did not have a cell phone when he was at his desk. That is where things were. Things were done by mail. And when you left for the day, if it's a Friday, they're not seeing anything till the mail arrives or he shows up at the office on Monday, and people still got things done. But then when I talk to senior architects that want you to push your boundaries and work all these crazy hours and there are no weekends and you even need to be on 24/7, I find that like against each other because we built buildings when we didn't have cell phones and you weren't on call 24/7. And so I don't know if any of your courses and workshops that you've done have helped those senior professionals that are struggling with that. I've done this for so long in the profession and working so hard to pull back and let it be okay for people to have boundaries and set some of their own.
Yeah, so I have one course in particular. It's called Stressless Success. And it really is about this idea that so often we just look at our boss and we think, oh, I will be successful if I check all the boxes that he or she ticked and do all those things. Well, maybe we don't want to do those things, or we don't like doing those things, or those things aren't the right fit for our skill set. But we're going to pound that square peg into that round hole. On the other hand, if we are much more in touch with what we love to do, if we are doing work that energizes us, we are much more productive, we are much more creative, we're much more innovative, and we start to ask for the opportunities that we want. So this course is really about helping people get that clarity, but also to deal with a lot of the common pitfalls that we encounter that derail us because we're all part of that codependent culture where we want to make other people happy, so that you really can get the soft skills that you need to do more, better in less time, but also to do what you really want to do, what's going to make you feel successful, not just get you a certain pay or a certain title that feels empty once you get there because it's really not what you want to do.
Yeah. And I feel even the younger generations coming up, they just want to speed up their career and get to those levels so quickly that they don't take time to figure out what they actually want to do. Or I see the ones that see the senior professionals that are just trying to pound that square peg in a round hole and do the same thing to them to what their bosses did. And the generations coming up now aren't doing that. They see the leaders and it's like, I don't want to be like that. I don't want to be a principal because I see what you're doing and I don't want that life.
Right. And I appreciate that there is much more awareness of work-life balance. However, as you said, we're not in the same world that people were in even 20 years ago. So it's really more about work-life integration. So yes, the boundaries between work and your private life are very mutable. And sometimes they're even blurred. You don't know where one stops and the other begins. But that doesn't mean that the amount of time you spend working should suddenly
take
grow
over
so much. Right,
Yeah.
right. It should not push everything else out. That actually makes you a worse architect than when you are more well-rounded because of all that adjacent possible. And, research shows that the stress response is a physiological thing that is part of how we evolved as humans to survive. So it is about fight or flight, which if we actually were facing a physical danger and we had to run away or fight, we would burn off the adrenaline and the cortisol. But when we have the constant chronic stress that we experience today, and it is psychological in so many ways, we don't burn those hormones off. They accumulate. And what do? Well, your body is in survival mode, so it shuts down your immune system, your digestive system, higher levels of thought, sends all the blood to your limbs. So the very things we need today to cope with the kind of stress we have, our body's taking away from us because it's trying to do a different response. And we can counterbalance that by doing the things we love, by having the well-rounded life, not only because we're taking better care of ourselves, but when we're doing things we love, we get hits of the pleasure chemicals, and oxytocin is one of those. And it gets released when we feel joy and gratitude and trust. And what's really interesting about oxytocin and cortisol is that they're regulate one another. So if the oxytocin level's up, the cortisol level goes down because it actually triggers a suppression of it. So the more you do that you enjoy and have fun doing, it will actually turn off that stress response. And that's really important because the opposite is also true. You will enjoy your life less if you're too stressed out.
Yeah, I always find it's almost a bad analogy, and you can only think of it in one stream of what you're doing, and you can't pull career and life and other stresses. But if work is always the more like a roller coaster, if it's always on an upswing or you're always in the crazy stress dynamic of a roller coaster, then that becomes the norm and you can't feel anything else. But when you are riding a roller coaster, they have those different changes to let your body rest. So then your stress response can go at different moments, but you need that rest moment to be able to get that impact. And I always explain that with your career. There's going to be stressful days where, yeah, you're going to pivot and do a lot of your career one day. You're going to have a deadline that goes out, but then you need that weekend and maybe that next week to be at a lower stress level. It's out the door. Let's do more hobbies. Let's go do something with the family. Let's go out to eat or go to have a spa day, whatever works for you to help balance yourself out again, or else you're not going to be able to react. And you'll wake up in the shower not knowing how you got to the shower.
Exactly. Don't do that. That's not good. I don't recommend it.
And I know you also do the Architects as Healers with Megan Mazzocco. Mazzocco. What are you talking about on that side? Because that's a weekly discussion.
It is. And that's a really fun exploration of specifically how to design for well-being. So this is something I've been interested in for forever. And it's something that Megan has also a deep passion for. She's not an architect, but she has an interiors background and worked as a journalist in the industry for many years. She's also a Well AP and really devoted to studying well-being. So it was a natural fit. She actually saw a tweet that I did for one of the architecting podcast episodes and reached out to me, and we scheduled a phone call and couldn't stop talking because we're just like, wow, you care about this and I care about this. And Clubhouse at the time was a newer app, and we were both on it, and we're like, we should get on there and do a room on this topic. And we did. We talked about salutogenesis, or design for well-being, and that evolved to, we should do this more regularly, and we should reach out to people we know that are doing work that relates to this. So what we try to do with the podcast is bring on a guest expert. So actually today we had someone talking about trauma-informed design. We've had acousticians, we've had lighting designers, we've had engineers. So we really try to bring a breadth of people with expertise in some facet of design and well-being to talk about their work, hopefully network. We encourage everybody to connect with one another while they're on the app listening, and to reach out to one another, because we can often be lone wolves and spend a lot of time reinventing the wheel somebody else has already got working. So if we know more about one another and who's doing what work, we don't need to do it ourselves. We can just reach out to that person and collaborate. And that's what we're really trying to do with that show.
Yeah. And I think it ties it together too for you with, bringing in the healthcare side, but then helping professionals too. And so you do all this. I didn't know if you have any advice for people managing and juggling all these multiple facets to their career, whether it's getting involved in a community, podcasting, architecture. Do you have any advice for something that works for you?
Absolutely. So we talked a little bit about self-care, and self-care isn't just repair, like, oh, I had a really tough week, so I'm going to go get a massage. That's good to do. But self-care is really about that constant nurturing of your well-being. And, we can feel like we need to give it all away and that it's selfish. But the truth is, if we don't take care of ourselves, what we're giving away isn't anything anybody really wants. It's the toxic sludge, because that's all we got left. So self-care is really important for you to show up as your best self in your personal life, as well as if at work with your colleagues, with your clients, in your professional network. Get clear on what you love to do. And I have a lot of free resources on my website. If you go to architectingpodcast.com, that you can find right on the front page. There's also lots of other ways that you can work to get more clarity and connect those dots, because you're not going to get to do only what you want. Nobody gets to do that. But if you even spent 20% of your day doing what you really love, it will energize you. It will get you through having to look at a door schedule or specs or deal with a difficult client, because you have that sense of purpose that is very, very charged up. And that's what gives you energy. That's what gets you through and helps keep you motivated. And then make sure you have a good network around you. We are most aligned with the people we spend the most time with. And there's a theory out there that it's the 5 people actually you spend the most time with. So if you're spending time with a lot of people who are just as burned out and stressed out as you are, all the group of you are thinking about is lack and commiserating. And that's not helping anybody. But if you use your network, if you start to reach out to what I call a genius group, or people who are a little further ahead than you are, who can mentor you or talk to you, you start to see, how do they do it? What are their strategies? And how did they get to be successful? Because a lot of times we look at somebody who's successful and it's a foregone conclusion because we know how the story ended. We don't understand all the moments of doubt and trials and tribulations they had to get to that point. But if you get to know them, they can really help you see past a difficult situation or reframe something, or even give you the benefit of the wisdom that they've learned. So that's really important as well, to have that network so you don't feel alone and you don't feel stuck.
Yeah. And I find that person doesn't have to be the story's already written and you're at the end of the book. It could be they are just a chapter or two ahead of you. And those people can be just as influential and helpful to help you through, because they've at least experienced that chapter not too long ago.
They can actually sometimes be the best. I know you talk about this, that there's different kinds of mentors. And the reason that is so important is somebody who is, at the pinnacle of their career and, 20 years older than you can still learn from them. Mm-hmm. But it's harder to relate because they're not where you are. And even though they were there one day, the world didn't look like what it looks like now when they were there. But someone who's 3 years older than you and a little bit ahead of you is much more relatable to the issues that you are facing, because they probably face them as well.
Yeah, and have a little bit more time closeness in that relationship to help. And I always like wrapping up my podcast with this final question, and it's, what advice do you have for young professionals just starting their career?
I would say be generous with your time. I am too busy, I always say, is code for that's not my priority. The service you give to others elevates our profession. It is your opportunity to explore that thing you really, really, really want to do in a way that you might not get the opportunity to do within your firm. And also, things stack. So just like I talked about the adjacent possible, when you're working on things that you enjoy doing and you're clear, so like you said, Caitlin, you're not doing 50 unrelated things, you're doing 3 or 4 very similar things. What I'm doing here, I can suddenly borrow over here. And pretty soon there's this really nice stacking that is developing for you. So it's not doing the same amount of effort for, 10 different tasks. It's doing 4 tasks that then you can borrow the work you're doing and spread it across 10 different efforts. So when you're generous with your time, you'll get those opportunities to do those things that build up your library then of things you can pull from to get a project at work done, or to speak at a conference, or to do something else, because you've already got that experience to draw from.
Yeah, and it's so true, because I've noticed that with doing mentorDINO and doing that beyond architecture and having the podcast conversations I learn something from everybody I meet and talk to, and it's led to conferences, it's led to discussions and panels and all these things that, just taking one step in one direction, you never know what it leads and starts to stack and build up into other opportunities. But then I think it makes me a better architect and show up. So I think that's great advice. I think both of us are a testament on, doesn't matter what you get involved in and do, just find what works for your passions.
Yeah, absolutely. And do it. Take that action. Don't wait around for somebody else to read the tea leaves and say, oh, I know what you should do. Here, I have this opportunity all set up, because you'll be waiting for a really long time. You really have to claim the opportunities you want. And I always say, ask forgiveness, not permission. Because if you say, can I do this thing at your firm? You are setting off a chain reaction of bureaucracy, because most likely your boss can't just automatically say, oh yeah, maybe they can, but a lot of times they can't. On the other hand, if you say, hey, I've been working on this and I found a way to use it on our project, that's really the way in, because you've already got something going and it doesn't feel so open-ended, because when people are uncertain, they always say no.
Yeah. Give them more certainty as you step forward. And if anybody's looking for your courses or wanting to find your podcast or talk to you, what's the best way to find you?
Sure. So I am on LinkedIn at Angela Mazzi, but you can also go to my website, architectingpodcast.com, and find pretty much anything you need to. There is a tab for the podcast, Architecting. There's a tab for Architects as Healers, Buildings as Medicine, so you can listen to those replays. And there's also all the free stuff that you can download, a link to my 2 books. So one is called Career Crisis, which is about finding clarity. And the other is called Time Builder, which is about how to get more out of the 24 hours you have in a day so that your quality of life is high, but you're still being a high productive person. And also the courses I have. So one is called Thrive, which is a companion to the Career Crisis book. Another is the Stressless Success course that I talked about. And then I also do private coaching that you can book a half-hour discovery call and we can talk. And that is very customized to what people need. And I do also something called Salutogenesis for Your Soul, where I will come and talk to your group. And I've done these at different lengths. I've done some for the AIA Cincinnati Women in Architecture Committee, where it's a 20-minute session. I've done 2-hour sessions. I've done half-day sessions, so we can customize it. But it's basically about that personal well-being and that stress response reset that I can do. And there's a form on the website that you can fill out so that we can then follow up and see what you need and what dates you need to have me available. And you can book that as well.
Yeah. And I'll put all the links down below in the show notes, and we can put even more pictures up throughout the episode. So thank you so much, Angela, again, for taking the time to speak with me today.
Well, thank you so much, Caitlin. I really, really appreciate the work you're doing, and you have a much greater impact than you may even know you have, because people need to hear this stuff. People need to find that person to look up to, that way shower, because we all reach for the highest branch that we can see. So thank you for building this tree, this resource that is mentorDINO.
Yep. And I love seeing it grow. So I love the analogy of a tree. I'll have to use that for explaining how I've gotten here and into the future. So thank you, Angela. I hope you enjoyed our discussion today. Learn some advice to take with you and see how our industry is all tied together to create the world around us. Check out the description below for any links or resources we discussed. If you liked the episode, please do me a favor and hit the subscribe button. Give me a thumbs up and leave a comment below. It really helps others be able to discover this resource and support finding that career path that best works for them. If you know someone that has inspired your own career that you'd like me to interview, let me know in the comments below, or you can reach out to me via my website or LinkedIn. I'd be happy to share their story or your own. Thank you again, and I cannot wait for the next career story I get to share with you next week.